I would argue we didn't really understand the ecological role of whales for a long time because when oceanography started, there really weren't any whales out there. Now we're starting to see what the oceans look like as whales come back. So this was the 1990s. I'd actually gone to Japan at that point to look at whale meat being sold on the marketplace, and we were finding a high level of fraudulence on the market. And I was also, in doing my master's degree at that point, I was taking marine ecology, sitting in the back of a class, and daydreaming a bit, but the professor was talking about the biological pump. Anyone who studies the oceans knows what this is. Basically, photosynthesis, of course, can only occur at the surface of the ocean where there's light. But as phytoplankton die and as zooplankton and fish feed upon those, the organic matter tends to settle. That's the biological pump, right? You're seeing this organic matter settle, carbon, other nutrients settling to the bottom. Well, as I was in class, I had noticed something very different when I was out in the oceans. And what I would see, and I recently had been in my attic and uncovered my notebook from that class the day I was taking that class, and put in, when right whales and other whales feed, they go to the bottom, and they come to the surface, and they release enormous nutrients. Has anyone ever seen whale feces? Just wondering if anyone's ever been out on a boat and see that. Yeah, a few. It's this enormous plume. The plume can be as large as the research boats that we use. So they're going down to the surface. They have mud on their heads often. They're coming up, and rather they're going down at depth, and they come to the surface and release those plumes. And even then, as early as that first day when I had this idea, I wrote, what about when there were 10,000 whales? I was studying right whales at the time. There were only maybe 400, 500 in the ocean, in the North Atlantic. But what about when there were 10,000? How would that have influenced the ocean and productivity in the ocean? So for those of you who are wondering, those who haven't seen whale feces, there's some, I believe that's from blue whales here at the bottom. And then here you could see another sort of fecal plume, this wide plume, almost admittedly like diarrhea. Here's the first image that I put together with Jim McCarthy, who's here at OEB. Here's the biological pump with nutrients going down. And here are whales feeding beneath the euphotic zone, that is in the dark part of the ocean, coming to the surface and releasing those nutrients. Well, we submitted that. And we submitted it as a model. And our reviewers noted that we live in Massachusetts. We didn't actually go out and collect any of this feces. So we realized we had to go out and actually go and collect this. So you can see that there, judged as one of the worst jobs in science. Any of you have ever seen feces, you could see it sort of just beneath the surface. But if you've been close, you know it really stinks. It's got a very strong smell. If you get it on your clothes, basically you can't wash that smell out. So what did we find? Indeed, that there are very high levels of both nitrogen and phosphorus in the fecal plumes. These can be the limiting nutrients in many ocean systems. The other one is iron, and that colleagues of mine have worked in the southern hemisphere looking at iron in the fecal plumes. I don't think Pete came back, but Pete is a colleague of mine. We've worked together on looking at the microbiome. Oh, there he is. Pete, we don't collect this by hand. So if you're worried, there's well, that's how you guys have been telling me we've been doing it in plankton nets. We don't do that. But this is a colleague of mine who just shows you for size. So high levels of phosphate and ammonium indeed in those fecal plumes. So why does that matter? Well, in the summertime, a lot of this work was done on Stellwagen Bank, so right here off of Massachusetts. In the wintertime, you have lots of churning, high nutrients, it's windy, right? So you don't tend to have any nutrient limitation, but in the summer, a thermocline forms, that is between the upper area, the warmer upper body, and the colder lower area. Lots of nutrients in that lower area where you don't have sunlight or very low sunlight. At the surface, though, there's a decline in nutrients. This is when whales are most abundant in that area. So they're going up and back and forth through that thermocline, feeding below it, and this indicates the population of whales off the coast of Massachusetts, but this is true for many areas. This is the time when they're releasing those nutrients. So it's ecologically important at that point. Even more important, and again, I had mentioned, even early on, I realized, well, we're in a time of whale deficit. Even if whales are coming back, we're still looking at an ocean that's largely emptied of whales. What about in the past? Well, this is when whales would have really been major drivers in these ocean systems. And I argue and I hope that they'll be important again as populations start to come back. This is before humans impacted the oceans. Coastal point source, so there wasn't any sewage there. Atmospheric deposition was at about 20%, it is now. That is from nitrogen coming out of the atmosphere. And then this is trying to judge how, we don't really know how many whales there were in the past, so this gives 3 scenarios. Either way you look at it, whales were major drivers at that point in the past, and we hope can be in the future. So recently I worked with a colleague of mine who was then at Oxford. We were looking at, so we have this calculation for whales, but how do other animals play a role? How can we, in a sense, revitalize nutrient cycling on the planet? Not only in the oceans, the whales are bringing up phosphate, nitrogen, and iron. In this case, we're looking at phosphorus here. So if whales are bringing that up, how can that actually get on land? The phosphorus that we're now using throughout much of the world is mined in areas like Morocco and brought to the farms. Is there a way that we can bring back some populations of animals that can help redistribute this phosphorus essentially for free? So we have whales bringing it to the surface. How could that come on land? Well, historically, and we'll hear some talk about this today, anadromous fish, and think about salmon in the Pacific Northwest might be a classic story. They're bringing those nutrients upstream, right? We don't have to carry them up out of the ocean. They're actually doing it when they die or when they're breeding. They're bringing nutrients up to the surface, or rather up the watersheds. We also see seabirds can bring this towards land as well. Once it gets up there, it can be distributed. In the case of salmon, maybe by bears or eagles, and eventually herbivores and other megafauna are distributing it. So this is sort of our dream, is to think about, can that happen? I live in Vermont, in a place like Lake Champlain. How could this happen? One, you could have filter feeders, freshwater mussels in that case, but you could restore salmon populations that could bring some of these nutrients up. Beavers can help retain it. Someone had spoken about beavers earlier today. Deer and perhaps even predators can distribute this phosphorus. This is going to be a challenge, but we're working towards that, right? We're seeing that. This is another ecological advantage that we can have of restoring these populations. So there it gives you an example of just how big whales can be, right? Historically, that when whales were abundant in the oceans, they were probably taking about 200,000 tons of carbon per year out of the atmosphere through these whale falls. Now it's down to about 30,000 tons of carbon. But as we see whale populations come back, this could be one way of mitigating and sequestering carbon. Again, they're storing it in their bodies, and it's also sequestering it in the deep sea. Whales are just part, of course, of a whole suite of animals that play a large role in the carbon cycle in the oceans. Here we see the whale pump, but of course large fish, bony fish also are sequestering this. So by restoring the oceans, both of large mammals, but also large fish, it could have a big impact on global climate. Again, I'll end on a positive note. We can turn this around, and we did. The Marine Mammal Protection Act, passed in 1972, has been phenomenally successful.